All right, so just before we go sort of out of the, while we're still talking vaguely about kernels and services, there's a couple technologies that are probably worth talking about. Maybe session zero isolation and maybe MIC or UIPI. I forgot, don't recall what it's called officially now.
Yeah, how about I'll talk about services and related to that is the session zero change, because one of the ways I think about the changes that we've done in Vista is I think about Vista as this onion. So there are different layers of the onion, and I think about the kernel kind of being in the middle of the onion. And then I think about system services as being the next layer of the onion.
Yep.
So system services are basically these background processes, if you will, that are running generally when there's, they start pretty early after boot, before the user logs in. Then they implement common functions like the SMB file server. It's running there as a service. A lot of antivirus software runs as a service. It's always up and running. This was an area that we spent a lot of time looking at in Windows Vista in terms of how do we improve the reliability of this area, and also one of the big things I looked at was how do we improve the security of this area. So one thing that we recognized a few years ago was that a lot of attacks were focused on system services, and there were many different reasons for that, but the top ones were really around the fact that the code was always up and running. So even if no user was logged on, an attacker could rely on that code being there and running. The second fact that was generally the case was that most of this code is running at the highest possible privilege level. So if you can somehow get in and own that code, you've now basically taken over, or you have the ability to take over the whole system.
And that's privilege level in the sense of user account? So there's sort of guest and power user and admin, and then system, or is there a different sense of privilege you're thinking about there?
In services parlance, there are really 4 scenarios associated with privilege level for services prior to Vista. And those were, there's the local system account. It's not a real user account. It's basically a baked-in identity in Windows. And that local system, basically, it's administrator plus other privileges. So it's more powerful than administrator. Then we've got something called local service, which is a very privilege-constrained account. So there actually is the equivalent of a user account backing local service. Local service, if it tries to make a call onto the network, it's unauthenticated. So if I've got a service running as local service and it tries to connect to the Active Directory, it'll connect as anonymous. So it can't really do much remotely. Then we've got network service, which is very similar to local service, but it has access to your machine credential.
So it can impersonate you? Well,
it can actually impersonate the machine credential. So when you join a domain, there's basically a domain computer account that backs your computer, and that provides authenticated access for operations that originate either from local system or from network service. So this machine here is joined to the NTDev domain, and I'll just say that it's foo1, that's the name of this machine. So if I make an outbound connection from local system or network service to the Active Directory, the Active Directory would, if it authenticated me, it would determine the call is coming from foo1 $, and then he can make an access control decision based on that. So generally speaking, if you're thinking about this from the perspective of like a network worm or something traveling across the network, network service and local system will allow authenticated machine traversal in a domain environment. So that was another factor. And then the other one that was really a problem pre-Vista was a lot of these services listened on the network. So they were ripe targets for worms and other network-facing attacks.
All right. So just to go to enumerate the 3 again: always running code.
Yep.
At high privilege, and had open network ports, so they had an attack surface remotely.
Exactly. Yeah, those were the top level issues, and then you could basically convince yourself pretty easily if you looked at the different worms the prevalent worms out there that, okay, yeah, these were all attacking services, like Sasser, SQL Slammer, just to name a couple of very high-profile ones. Those were attacking services. So we said that because of that, let's make a pretty big change to the system here to try and mitigate that class of issues. So what that led to is we've introduced a new feature in Vista called Windows Service Hardening, and it really has several key components that help basically a service writer minimize the exposure in their service. So one thing we've said is that the person that writes the service is in the best position to understand the constraints that should be applied to their service. And these are constraints like, okay, what privileges should the service hold? What network ports is it allowed to listen on or communicate with in an outbound fashion? What account is it running in? And then we looked at something even more significant than what you've seen in prior operating systems. What resources is the service allowed to write to in the system? So looking at those different vectors there, what we came up with was really kind of a tiered solution here that provides a range of things that services can utilize. So the first thing that a service can do is, and this is all in an opt-in basis, so we don't just turn this on for every service in the system. The service writer actually has to opt into it. And one thing that we did is we said that in Vista, every service in the system has to go through a process of understanding what the correct constraints are to apply to their service. So we sat down with over 100 service owners in Vista and basically defined these profiles that are applied to the services when Vista is set up. So
these are the services that start in the box by default, written by
the
Microsoft.
ones that are written by Microsoft. And we also engaged with a number of third parties. In particular, we talked to a lot of security vendors because they've got code that's very highly prevalent. It's installed on a lot of machines. It has the same characteristics. They typically run a high privilege. They're listening on the network because they have management interfaces. So we sat down with a bunch of those ISVs, and they've started using the infrastructure as well. But the areas are basically, one is, so we provide a mechanism to identify the service uniquely. So in the past, we had talked about the 3 accounts, and then there was a fourth degenerate case that I didn't mention, and that is that you can configure a service to run in an arbitrary user account. Most people don't do that because there's a lot of management burden associated with creating the account, updating the password, etc. So the first thing that we've made very easy in Vista is identifying the service. And we've introduced something called a service SID. And a SID is a security identifier in NT security parlance. So this is an identifier that appears in the access token that's assigned to the service process. So what we've done is we've made an easy way for a service owner to say, hey, I want to be able to identify myself, give me a service SID. So what happens is when that service starts, he now gets a unique SID in his service. And that SID will be the same on every machine where that service is installed. So what I can do now is I can say that instead of my registry key or my file system resources being accessible to all services running as, say, network service, I can now say that these resources are only accessible by my service SID.
So this is very similar to the way that people would use ACLs and permissions to protect with
Correct.
user SIDs, right? And said, Jay Masner has read access and Charles Torrey has write access. You could now say the service of this ID has no access or
Correct.
read-only access.
Now, also, one thing I would ask too is, one of the things that's always kind of a bummer is, from a user's point of view, is to figure out what exact service is causing a problem. or consuming a lot of CPU, all you get to see is that service host.exe is running,
Yes.
which tells us basically nothing.
Right. So in Vista,